Welcome to My Life in Sport. I'm Phil Bowers, a legal director at O'Connor's, and this podcast will delve into the diverse and fascinating world of the business of sport. For many, sport is more than just a game. It is a powerful industry that shapes careers, drives economies, and transforms lives. In this series, I talk to individuals for whom the business of sport has been central to their professional careers. From the leaders of sports clubs and sports businesses to the regulators who maintain the integrity of the game. Join me as I explore the stories of the people behind the business of sport.
Today I'm joined by James Robinson, the current team principal of Invicta Racing and co-founder of Pace 64. James, a warm welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Phil. Great to be here.
James, I think it's nearly 2 decades of involvement in motorsport, and during that time you've worn a number of different hats in the industry. Maybe I should say helmets, being motorsport. How sport shaped your career to date in the industry?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I've always been a big sports fan. Like a lot of people, I'm a sports addict, and I take enjoyment from watching any sport, any live sport. And I was one. I think, like a lot of people, I was really surprised during COVID by how much just losing sport for those few months that we lost it was how much that impacted my life. Having those sort of micro breaks during the day to be able to say, "Oh, I wonder who's playing in the Premier League tonight," or what was the result? What was the result in last night's game, or what motorsport events going on this weekend? Or as a sports fan, it really reminded me how much you need it, or how a lot of people need it, and certainly I did, as for those sort of like micro escapism moments. But professionally, I mean, motorsport has been my life. It has defined me. It's defined what I've done for the last 20 years, and if that didn't exist, I would probably have had a very different life to now.
We'll touch on Pace to start with. So you founded Pace age 30 after extensive F1 experience prior to that as a commercial director there. Have you always been interested in business, and have you always had a desire to be an entrepreneur? And what led you to that decision to move from F1 to set up Pace? And if you could just explain what Pace is as well, that would be great. I know there's been a merger now, but historically what Pace was.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I always had a sort of desire to work in motorsport as a kid. And you did a number of internships around the motorsport world from the age of 16 to 21 while I was still at school and uni, and they were really defining for me. Really helped me get my I was really lucky to get a really broad range of experience very early on, and I got my first job in F1 with what is now called Alpine F1 team, what was called Renault F1 team back then. But I always had this. So motorsport was very much my big passion, but my secondary passion in life, I guess, was business. And doing what I do now was a really nice way to combine the two. And so the business side of motorsport was always what's fascinated me. How these work as businesses, how these operations sustain themselves has always been was always my fascination growing up. And so you're working for the commercial team, of a Formula One team. Age 21 was a bit of a dream come true, and then I managed to climb the greasy pole, and but I was always interested in entrepreneurship, in running my own business, and I think being part of a big company was great grounding and taught me teachers one an awful lot. But I've always found that the smaller the company I've worked in, the more enjoyment I've got out of it, and the greater satisfaction I have from covering a much wider sort of portfolio of areas within the company. And whilst I was at Renault, I got good experience of that, because the team went from being owned by a tiny private equity company to being owned by Group Renault, and then back again, and we, the team changed hands 2 or 3 times in the 12 years that I was there. And so I always found the smaller the group that I worked with, the more enjoyment I got out of it. And I always had this sort of frustrated part of me to wanting to be an entrepreneur, wanting to run my own business. And quite frankly, I just wasn't brave enough to take the leap at the beginning. And it's not for everybody, but I really was keen to do it. And then I got this opportunity to work for F1 under Liberty Media, in this initial intake of people that came in under the Liberty Media ownership of F1, and got to work at F1 in this sort of very initial phase, as season 1 and 2 of Drive to Survive was going out, and we were putting the building blocks in place for what is now been a stratospheric growth of the sport over the last few years. And then I got this, and then I was offered an opportunity to work on a more sort of entrepreneurial project in F1, and it was going to be clearly a big conflict to what I was doing at F1, and so I took the leap of faith to do that, and it was, in hindsight, the right decision. I've certainly got more satisfaction from being a business owner than I have ever from being an employee. It's really stressful at times, and a lot of, especially in the initial years, a lot of sleepless nights, and a lot of nervousness around if I've made the right decision, how you're going to pay the bills, how you're going to, you haven't got a guaranteed income. It's takes a lot of getting used to, especially I think if you've always done it, I don't think it's an issue. But when you've had 10, 15 years of having a solid paycheck coming in, then it can be quite terrifying. But the reward that one gets from it, and satisfaction from growing your business is like nothing else I've experienced in my professional life. So yeah, anyway, I had this sort of opportunity to do a more enterprising project outside of motorsport, and that was really what was the sort of nucleus of Pace, which is a consultancy, a motorsport consultancy, and then that grew into a much bigger operation that provided sort of white label commercial services, predominantly sort of sponsorship sales, but also sort of media rights and licensing to rights holders in motorsport, which is what sort of the foundation of what Pace is. And then we merged with another agency run by a good friend of mine called Ben Cowley, that provides social media services, again as a sort of white label service, again exclusively in motorsport. And so we founded those two agencies together, and they became Pace 64, and that's been pretty successful merger, and that business has grown and gone from strength to strength. And in 5 years, we've gone from nothing to becoming the largest agency in motorsport. That's purely dedicated to motorsport, at least. We've got over 50 people in the business, across multiple geographies and areas around the world. And we're obviously very proud of what we've built. Wouldn't have done it any differently.
It's really interesting, that, James, and a great overview of career to date and what's happened so far in terms of Pace, which has now become Pace 64 on social. So you talked about the preference in F1 to work in maybe a smaller environment and to you feel more comfortable in that type of environment, and that really honed your entrepreneur skills. Come out of F1, gone into Pace, started your own business, and then found a partner to merge with. For businesses who are considering a merger, what were the key drivers for you in relation to that merger, and what's been your learnings since? Because obviously finding the right partner is key to success.
Yeah, I couldn't. That is absolutely crucial, and where I think the key ingredients, I would say, for the merger that Ben and I undertook with Pace and 64 from Social, which is now Pace 64, and we've now taken on board the third partner in the last 6 months, called Christian Dixon, who joined us from McLaren to run our brand consultancy division. But initially, I go back to the merger. What were the key ingredients behind that? I would say the first one is by far the least important. Actually, isn't important at all, but it's just coincidental, and I think it's good context, which is that Ben and I are really good friends, and in many ways, actually, that's probably a hindrance. But it is, it's the most important one in some respects, because it's probably the sort of key driver as to why we do it, because we like each other, and it's obviously really important to work with people that you like. I would say, but I would also say it's probably the least important, because, and also can be the biggest problem in our professional relationship, because sometimes we probably don't have as honest a conversations as we need to, because we are always worried about jeopardizing our friendship. And I think it's also probably the least important, because you don't necessarily need to like people to be good partners with them and good teammates with them. There are so many great examples in and I think sport is a really good example of this, of teams, of teammates that have formed great partnerships that really didn't like each other and didn't get on. And there's loads of examples in sporting history that teaches you this. But Ben and I do get on, and we're best mates, and that's a really good thing. But the more important, I think, fundamental ingredients to our merger, which I think I would certainly say to anybody who is looking to do something like this, is that we merged our two companies. We have, but because of what our offering is from a client basis, we don't compete with each other. And so Ben provides, as I said, Ben's business, 64 from Social, does provide his side of the company, provides social media, content creation, and communicating sort of wider comms services to teams in motorsport, drivers in motorsport. My side of the business provides commercial services, and those two things don't conflict with each other. But they do enhance each other, and they do help each other. So we share a lot of resource in areas like graphic design, a little bit of research and sort of editorial when we have to write sort of decks and proposals and things. People who are just really good who've got really good language skills. That helps us a lot, and obviously that really helps on the comm side of the business as well when it comes to writing press releases or writing copy or whatever. So there are areas which we collaborate, but our sort of core businesses are very different, and so we both bring a lot of value to the party that's non-competing. I think that's really important, and then from the way we've structured the business means that we're never really fighting over, or not to any sort of great extent at least, the successes or the any margins and things like that, and the profitability, and also operationally as well. We respect each other and we help each other, but we don't dictate to each other. So if Ben wants to hire an extra, social media manager for his business, I'll give him my opinion on it, but I'm not going to dictate to him what to do, because at the end of the day, he, his side of the business makes a profit and he retains that, and vice versa for my side. So if I want to hire a commercial manager or whatever into my business, again, he'll give me his opinion and I'll ask for it, and it's really helpful, but I'm not dictated to him by that. And I've seen loads of businesses, where friends have got together and started agencies, especially in the agency world, and that the two founders are really, really similar in terms of what they do. They basically both did the same job, and obviously that sort of ticks the sort of often the sort of friendship box. But I've often seen those relationships fall apart because they often then get into difficulty as to, okay, well, obviously in that scenario, we just split everything 50-50, but often you'll find, you get 2 or 3 years down the line and one of the guys feels that he's kept pulling the other guy. And so you have a lot of sort of awkward conversations about how you split profits and what have you. And so Ben and I don't get that, because our worlds are so different to some extent. And so obviously there are, as I said, there are sort of crossover areas, but those are quite minimal. And so fundamentally, we're left to be somewhat autonomous. And that's been super helpful. And then similarly with Christian coming in now as to run our brand consultancy division, again, we're able to be quite we're able to treat that as that third area of our business with a degree of autonomy that really doesn't brew any of this sort of underlying resentment that can brew over time when you're too similar. And then I think thirdly as well, that difference between us gives us great ability to help each other and gives us great sort of roundedness in terms of our full sort of skill set package. We tend to, I think we have a really good coverage across sort of all of our soft skills as a management group, as a director group, the three of us, because we come at the same sport, but with very different skill sets, but with the same philosophy, and which is obviously really important. I guess that would be, fundamentally the most important thing is that we all three of us have the same philosophy to running businesses and how we run the company.
Yeah. So really, it's the differences that to bring you together in many ways, and the core businesses being different, and the non-compete element, which actually creates a successful joint business, underpinned by that philosophy and underpinned by the values that each of you share going into business. So really interested in that, James. Your role is team principal and CEO of Invicta Racing. With these two hats on, how are you balancing on-track performance with commercial growth? We'll get onto Invicta separately on the next question. But yeah, just in terms of that on-the-track performance and then commercial growth off the track, how do those two mirror up?
Yeah, it depends on what your philosophy is here. So, I think generally speaking, as it relates to motorsport, and I just give you a sort of model as to the commercial model as to how junior motorsport works, because it's very different to Formula One, and I don't think a lot of people are aware of this. But outside of Formula One, obviously in Formula One, the drivers race for the team and they get paid a salary, and the teams are funded by prize money and by independent sponsorship. In Formula 2, the vast majority of the team's revenue is underwritten by the drivers, and the drivers effectively pay to race for the team. And so the drivers then fund that either through their families or through independent sponsors, or they might be part of an F1 academy. It's normally a sort of combination of all three. And so we have sometimes you get a scenario where sort of the wealthier drivers might not be the most talented, or vice versa. Sometimes that can be the opposite case. And so it's all about trying to find a balance between the driver that will ultimately bring you on track performance, and that has to be the key thing. But also, if you look at your business hat on, how are we going to be able to cover our costs? And our ambition as a team is not to make yourselves wealthy from an OpEx perspective or from a sort of cash flow perspective. We're running the business to, one, provide value to our parent brand, Invicta Watch Group, but two, also long term we see a real appreciable rise in the value of the franchise, because, so to speak, it's a team, but to use a sort of more American term or business term, the franchise, through the growth of the sport, which we've seen from the fact that TV audiences have grown 3x in the last 5 years for F2 and F3, on the coattails, obviously, of F1's boom in popularity. And so, we think there's a real untapped potential in the championship. It's the most followed single-seater racing series in the world, outside of F1. More followers than Formula E, for example, more followers and viewers than, say, Formula E, for example, or World Endurance Championship or IndyCar. And I think we think there's a good ceiling there to help commercialize that, obviously to bring in independent sponsors as well. So those are sort of those are sort of the key long-term drivers for us in terms of value and in terms of balancing on-track competitiveness with balance sheet performance. For us, it's really making sure that we effectively cover our costs, but fundamentally have the two most who we think are going to be the two quickest drivers available to us in the car.
For F2 novices like myself, all of the cars are the same specification from what I understand. So how do you use that commercial focus to actually try and enhance on-track performance? So how do you give yourself a competitive edge? Is it through those external sponsorships that you can bring into the team to drive growth?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally the key driver, because you're right. So in Formula 2 and Formula 3 and basically all single-seater racing categories outside of Formula 1, the cars are all ostensibly the same, or they are the same. They're made by the same company. And we obviously have things that we can change in the car from a setup perspective, but that we can't do any R&D work. We can't make our own components. We can't develop our own IP. So, technical IP. Yeah. So no, that's completely different to F1, and that is a huge difference between how F1 and F2 operate. It's in terms of how we then drive that on-track success. It's really from the quality of the engineering. The quality of the driver makes a huge difference, and the driver makes a much bigger difference in F2 than it does in F1. Because the cars are the same, the field spread in F2 is normally about, in Hungary, I think qualifying the gap from pole to 22nd, which is the last position on the grid, was I think 1.9 seconds. In F1, it wasn't too long ago. The field spread has narrowed a lot in F1 in the last few years, but not too long ago it was 4 or 5 seconds. It's probably down to about 2.5 now, but the field spread is a lot wider in F1. And obviously, last year in F2, for example, every single team won a race. Has never happened in Formula 1 history at all. Often been there have regularly been years where only 2 teams have won a race. It's it's much harder to have a competitive edge and a sustained competitive edge. But quality of engineering, quality of mechanics, quality of the sort of personnel on the team, like any business really, it's the quality of the people that really are the defining and driving factor. And yes, third-party relationships with partners and suppliers obviously very important as well. But that's really secondary to the quality of the personnel in the organisation.
And James, you mentioned there that the teams own their technical IP. And I know we've spoken previously about one of the strategies behind Invicta is potentially commercializing this IP. So could you just talk about how motorsport businesses can do this generally, and is there an overlap with other sports about how this IP could be used, or other industries?
Yeah, so what we really want to try and do with our team, and goes back to what I was saying on the previous question, but one, which is that we think that there's a huge amount of opportunity in F2, given the size of the audience, given how engaged the fan base is. And I can see it in our social media activity, the engagement that we have from fans, and that there is a really strong and engaged fan base in this championship. And so, but in terms of the tools that we have at our disposal for commercialization, they're very limited. And so being the first F2 team to be owned by a consumer brand, that gives us a unique opportunity to explore that side of the sport, which obviously F1 teams are a lot further down the road in doing than we are. And they would say, I think they would agree that they are still quite a long way behind behind the curve compared to, say, Premier League football clubs, in terms of sort of fan engagement, activities, direct to consumer activities. So what we want to try and bring our F2 team as close as possible to, I would say, the back of the F1 grid in terms of what we do on that front. And that goes, all sorts of touch points, content, merchandise, events, on track activities, off track activities, above the line, below the line. There's a plethora of different ways in which we can do that. And we're just exploring them now. We're just sort of getting our teeth into them, but we're going to be rolling out a lot of initiatives over the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, look forward to it. James, I always like to end on a personal question. So lastly, what are your ambitions for Formula 2 and Invicta over the next 5 years? Where do you want to take the sport and the team?
Sure. So, from our perspective right now, the key is to continue to be successful on track. That's number one. The second area of importance is to start dominating off track. To the point I mentioned earlier, we would like to be the most engaged and followed and popular team in F2 in the next 2 or 3 years. That's a big ambition for us. And then in terms of our business operations, there's immediate opportunity for us to try and go down the motorsport ladder, for single-seater motorsport ladder. So we're the only team right now in F2 that doesn't race in F3. We'd like to try and put that right as soon as possible. We'd also like to explore other single-seater categories in F4 and a Formula Regional, for example. We may even look to participate in sports car racing as well, but Formula 2 will be our core focus for the foreseeable future, and will remain our core focus until unless an opportunity came for us to move it up into the top tier of motorsport, i.e. Formula 1. But obviously, that's a very, very, very big mountain to try and summit, and a lot of teams in F2 have tried and failed, whether by not even getting on the grid or getting on the grid for a very short period of time. There are a litany of examples that you can point to there. And so, if we were to do that, we would really want to do it right and do it with the right partners and do it in a way that was very sustainable and would deliver us success, not just be, making up the numbers. So that's a very big project, and something that we'll have to sit and wait and take a really long-term view on. But that's not really answering your question, because that's almost certainly well beyond 5 years from now. But yeah, and so in this sort of short to medium term, which is what I would classify the 5-year period, is really continue to be successful on track and to really develop on our commercial objectives off track, and growing the team's presence in terms of our fan base and how we deliver value to fans of F2 over the next 4 or 5 years.
Okay. Well, one step at a time, and it sounds that you'll be in pole position if that F1 opportunity does arise with the success at Invicta at the moment. And James, I think that's a fitting place to end the podcast and wave the proverbial checkered flag. James, thanks for your time. It's been really, really interesting, a great insight into your life and career in motorsport. I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, James, thanks again. It's been great.
Lovely. Thanks, Phil. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. My Life in Sport is brought to you by O'Connor's, the law firm for sport. Find out more at o'connors.law.